The night of February 24, 1994, began like many others in Memphis, Tennessee. By the following week, what had started as a routine evening had become the focus of one of the state's most complex criminal investigations. 3 individuals left a duplex neighborhood that evening and did not return. Marcellos Cello Anderson, his mother, Delois Anderson, and a young man named Frederick Tucker were reported missing when they failed to show up at home, interrupting routines and prompting concern from relatives and neighbors. Law enforcement quickly treated the case as urgent, issuing missing person notices and reviewing leads throughout the region. A vehicle linked to the missing group was located abandoned in Mississippi, raising questions about the circumstances of their departure and the potential involvement of others. A week after the group vanished, detectives followed information that led them to Rose Hill Cemetery in Memphis. There, a disturbance beneath an existing burial plot drew their attention. Upon examination, all 3 missing individuals were found within a concealed excavation beneath another grave. This unexpected discovery transformed a disappearance into a major homicide investigation and set in motion a chain of events that would challenge investigators, prosecutors, and the courts. The person held responsible for orchestrating these events was Tony Von Carruthers, a man whose interactions with the victims and the community would later come under intense scrutiny. Carruthers' actions and his conduct during the legal process raised questions about legal representation, competency, and accountability under the justice system, issues that continue to resonate decades later. If you want to understand how this case unfolded step by step, and the legal and investigative complexities that followed, stay with us. Make sure you subscribe now to follow this examination all the way through, and if you think you already know how this case ends, comment below with your thoughts on what justice should look like. In early 1994, Marcellos Cello Anderson was a young man known in parts of Memphis for his involvement in the city's informal economy. Court records show he carried himself in a way that drew attention. He wore noticeable jewelry, carried sums of cash, and had connections in local circles where money and trade changed hands frequently. Documents from the trial also noted that he stored additional funds at his mother's home. Delois Anderson, age 43, was Marcellos' mother. She was described in legal filings as a caretaker whose daily routines revolved around her home and family. There is no indication in court records that she was directly involved in the economic activities associated with her son. 17-year-old Frederick Tucker was a friend of Marcellos and was present with the Andersons on the night they disappeared. Testimony established that Tucker was not considered part of the economic circles associated with Marcellos, but his association placed him in proximity to the events that unfolded that February evening. The interactions between Marcellos and Tony Von Carruthers were central to prosecutors' theory in the case. Evidence admitted at trial included statements from persons familiar with both men, suggesting that Carruthers had mentioned plans in letters written before his release from prison about targeting individuals associated with valuable cash or goods. Prosecutors used these materials to frame a motive tied to financial gain and control of neighborhood economic activity. On the evening of February 24, Marcellos, Delois, and Frederick left the Anderson residence together. This group was last seen departing in a compact sport utility vehicle. When they failed to return, family members contacted authorities, and a missing person investigation began. Within days, the situation shifted from concern to a full homicide inquiry as law enforcement pieced together the known movements of the 3 individuals and initiated searches extending beyond Memphis. Throughout the early stages of the inquiry, testimonies and physical evidence began to paint a picture of a crime that involved more than a simple disappearance. Investigators noted connections between Carruthers and members of the group that suggested the evening's events were not coincidental. These developments laid the groundwork for an investigation that would uncover one of the more complex homicide cases in Tennessee history. Tony Von Carruthers was born on July 1, 1968. By the early 1990s, he had established a record of convictions in Memphis, including offenses involving violence. His history with the criminal justice system shaped both his behavior and the way prosecutors approached the case against him. In the summer of 1993, while incarcerated on an unrelated matter, Carruthers wrote letters to another inmate outlining what he described as a master plan to pursue financial gain through well-organized actions once he was released. These writings were later introduced in court as insight into his mindset and possible motives as events unfolded in 1994. In late 1993, Carruthers was assigned to a work detail at the West Tennessee Veterans Cemetery. During this assignment, he made comments to fellow inmates about graves and burial methods. Prosecutors referenced these remarks during trial to suggest premeditation in selecting a burial location. Carruthers' release from custody occurred in early January 1994. Around the same time, associates included James Montgomery, another man who would become central in later proceedings. Testimonies introduced during trial described conversations and interactions in which Carruthers discussed plans to target individuals he believed had valuable possessions or cash. Investigators later linked one such letter to writings from Carruthers while incarcerated in 1993. In the weeks following his release, statements from witnesses placed Carruthers in contact with various associates around Memphis. Authorities also identified interactions between Carruthers and Marcellos Anderson in the period immediately preceding February 24. Court records show that Anderson was known in some local circles for carrying money and jewelry, and that he maintained cash at his mother's residence. Prosecutors considered these details when presenting motives tied to robbery and economic gain. Throughout January and February 1994, Carruthers repeatedly clashed with individuals tied to his legal representation on unrelated matters. These disputes, documented in court filings, reflected his combative approach and foreshadowed later decisions to reject appointed counsel during the forthcoming capital murder proceedings. As February progressed, law enforcement began receiving information that linked Carruthers and Montgomery to Marcellos Anderson's associates. These connections formed part of the evidence that investigators would later expand upon following the disappearance of Anderson, his mother, and Frederick Tucker. The sequence of events in these weeks established a backdrop of preparation, contact, and unresolved conflicts in the neighborhood where this case would soon dominate law enforcement attention. On the afternoon of February 24, 1994, Marcellos Anderson borrowed a white Jeep Cherokee from his cousin, Michael Harris. Witnesses observed Anderson and Frederick Tucker in the vehicle around 4:30 p.m., accompanied by James and Jonathan Montgomery. These four men were seen traveling through parts of Memphis before arriving at the home of a relative of the Montgomery family shortly before 5 p.m. that day. At that house, several people, including a female relative and her children, were present when the group entered the basement together. Within a short time, James Montgomery returned upstairs and asked the relative if she could step outside for a few minutes, indicating that he needed to take care of some business. She later interpreted this request as unusual and expressed concern about the situation. Later that evening, family members of the Andersons grew worried when neither Marcellos nor Delois returned home. Early on February 25, law enforcement located the Jeep Cherokee in Mississippi at approximately 2:40 a.m. The vehicle had been destroyed by fire. This discovery added urgency to the missing persons investigation and raised questions about what had occurred after the group left the Montgomery relatives' residence hours earlier. Around 8:45 p.m. on February 24, an associate of the Montgomery brothers contacted a friend, reporting that the Andersons and Tucker were out at the cemetery and referencing a significant sum of money. Shortly after, arrangements were made for a vehicle to be used at the cemetery location. Although the precise intentions behind these early evening communications were unclear at the time, detectives later treated them as part of the timeline that connected the individuals involved in the missing persons. By the morning of February 25, the borrowed car used earlier that night was returned in a condition described by those who delivered it as unusually dirty. Law enforcement continued to interview witnesses who recalled the group's movements that evening and noted conversations indicating the individuals had discussed wrongdoing. While no direct confirmation of actions at the time was publicly available, the accumulation of these accounts contributed to law enforcement's understanding of the sequence of events and fed into their ongoing inquiry. In early March, investigators acting on information from a person later identified to police led detectives to Rose Hill Cemetery in Memphis. There, detectives focused on the burial plot of another individual, which had recently been filled. A separate excavation near that plot yielded the remains of the three missing individuals. This discovery marked a major turning point in the investigation and clarified that the events of February 24 had resulted in a complex and coordinated crime rather than a simple disappearance. If you want to follow how law enforcement shifted from missing persons report to full homicide investigation, and how evidence led to indictments, make sure you subscribe for full coverage. Those who want to weigh in on what motivated these actions, legal strategy, relationships, or neighborhood dynamics should add their perspective in the comments as we continue. Once the missing persons report was filed, law enforcement concentrated on the last confirmed sightings of Marcellos Anderson, Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. Officers pieced together several key movements from witness accounts and physical evidence. A burned Jeep Cherokee, associated with the victims, was discovered in Mississippi in the early hours of February 25, prompting questions about the events between their departure from Memphis and the vehicle's abandonment. This finding elevated the inquiry from a disappearance to a suspected criminal act. Detectives expanded their investigation on March 3, 1994 after a tip directed them to Rose Hill Cemetery in Memphis. Law enforcement obtained a court order and began examining a recent burial site. Beneath the burial plot of another individual, officers uncovered the remains of the 3 missing persons. The circumstances of the discovery confirmed that the victims had been placed in a prepared area beneath an already interred plot. Forensic experts were called in to assess the scene and examine the evidence. Specialists determined that the arrangement of the remains and the disturbed soil indicated deliberate placement rather than incidental positioning. Evidence collected at the cemetery was documented and entered into the investigative record, allowing detectives to establish a timeline and identify patterns consistent with pre-planning. Investigators also reviewed witness statements regarding conversations and activities involving Tony Von Carruthers, James Montgomery, and other associates in the hours leading up to and following February 24. Statements from co-conspirators and those familiar with the individuals provided context for decisions that would later form part of the prosecution's case. These testimonies referenced interactions and communications that linked Carruthers and Montgomery to the victims in the crucial hours before law enforcement located the burial site. At trial, the prosecution presented evidence indicating that Carruthers and his co-defendant arranged for the burial location to be prepared in advance. Documentation showed that the box and vault had been set in place at the cemetery before that plot was sealed. Testimony from cemetery personnel confirmed that the placement would have required coordination and effort at a time when the original burial plot was being prepared during regular working hours. Testimonies from multiple witnesses, combined with physical evidence and documentation of vehicle movements and locations, allowed investigators to build a cohesive timeline. Detectives identified overlapping patterns tying Carruthers and Montgomery to key decisions about transportation, communications, and logistics in the period leading to the discovery at Rose Hill Cemetery. In April 1996, the case against Tony Von Carruthers and his co-defendant James Montgomery moved to trial in Shelby County Criminal Court. Prosecutors presented indictments charging both men with first-degree premeditated murder in connection with the deaths of Marcellos Anderson, Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. The charges also included counts of especially aggravated kidnapping and aggravated robbery tied to events on the evening of February 24, 1994. A grand jury had previously returned these indictments based on evidence gathered during the investigation. Before the trial began, Carruthers cycled through multiple attorneys. Several lawyers withdrew at Carruthers' request or due to disagreements over defense strategy. Court records indicate that by mid-1995, the trial court had appointed counsel at least 3 times. Carruthers expressed dissatisfaction with each of his attorneys, leading to repeated requests for new counsel. The pattern continued until the court ultimately granted Carruthers the right to represent himself. The trial commenced with the prosecution laying out its case through witness testimony, evidence regarding the victim's disappearance, and demonstration of connections between the defendants and the events of February 24. While forensic evidence linked the victims to the burial site, the prosecution's narrative also relied on statements from witnesses who placed Carruthers and Montgomery in association with the victims in the hours before their disappearance. During trial proceedings, Carruthers' decision to act as his own attorney drew attention. The courtroom record shows that at various points Carruthers made objections and attempted to launch challenges to the prosecution's evidence. Observers noted that representing oneself in a capital case posed significant challenges, especially given the complexity of the charges and the number of counts against him. Testimony in defense of Carruthers included accounts from individuals who described his upbringing and character. Carruthers' sister testified about their family history, noting that he was raised in difficult circumstances and had encountered instability throughout his life. Another witness, involved in prison ministry, described his perception of Carruthers as a sincere individual who believed in his own version of events leading up to the case. These testimonies offered a counterpoint to the prosecution's evidence, though they did not directly dispute the sequence of events identified by investigators. After deliberation, the jury found both Carruthers and Montgomery guilty on all counts presented at trial. The convictions included 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of especially aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of aggravated robbery. Under Tennessee law, the jury was required to consider both mitigating and aggravating factors before recommending sentences for the murder convictions. In the sentencing phase, the jury determined that the aggravating factors outweighed any mitigating circumstances. Among the factors noted were prior convictions involving violence and the scale of multiple deaths occurring in a common course of conduct. Based on these findings, the jury imposed the death penalty for each of the murder convictions against Carruthers. Montgomery received similar sentences for the murder counts and additional long prison terms for kidnapping and robbery. Following the convictions, attorneys for Carruthers filed direct appeals. The Tennessee Supreme Court reviewed the case record, including issues related to the sufficiency of evidence and procedural rulings made during trial. In December 2000, the court affirmed all convictions and sentences, concluding that the evidence supported the jury's findings and that the legal proceedings conformed to state law. In subsequent years, Carruthers pursued post-conviction relief on several grounds, including claims of ineffective assistance of counsel and requests for additional DNA analysis of certain materials referenced during pretrial proceedings. Courts consistently denied these petitions, determining that Carruthers had not met the legal criteria for granting further review or new testing under applicable statutes. After the jury returned its verdict in 1996, imposing multiple death sentences on Tony Von Carruthers, the focus shifted from trial to a series of legal reviews. Carruthers and his legal team pursued a set of post-conviction challenges grounded in state and federal law. Among the issues raised were claims that his representation during trial was compromised by multiple attorney withdrawals and that the trial court's decision to allow him to represent himself had prejudiced his case. These appeals also argued that certain evidence had not been presented in a manner that fully protected Carruthers' rights under established legal standards. In the early 2000s, the Tennessee Supreme Court reviewed the convictions and sentences on direct appeal, concluding that the evidence presented at trial was sufficient to support the jury's findings and that procedural errors, if any, did not warrant reversal or modification of the death sentences. This affirmed the convictions and upheld the death penalty decisions issued at trial. Subsequent petitions in state courts sought post-conviction relief on issues including ineffective assistance of counsel and prosecutorial conduct. A trial was held on some of these claims between 2005 and 2006, after which the post-conviction court denied relief, a decision that was upheld by the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals. Carruthers then pursued further review in state and federal courts, including a habeas corpus appeal. In 2018, the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit affirmed the denial of federal habeas relief, concluding that Tennessee's handling of his legal representation and related competency findings did not contradict established precedent. Carruthers also filed requests for additional post-conviction DNA analysis under Tennessee's statutory provisions, seeking review of physical evidence in the case. These petitions were denied on the basis that the standards required to grant such testing were not met. Additional efforts to introduce DNA evidence many years after the trial did not result in new findings sufficient to alter the convictions or sentences. In September 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court issued an order scheduling an execution date for Carruthers in May 2026. The court's order noted that Carruthers had completed the required 3-tier appeals process under state law and that no legal barriers remained to execution. Carruthers filed a response opposing the setting of an execution date and sought a certificate of commutation on the basis of extenuating circumstances, including ongoing concerns about his competency. The court denied that request and remanded certain competency matters to lower courts for resolution in proximity to the scheduled date. The scheduled execution date, set for May 21, 2026, marks a culmination of decades of judicial review and procedural challenges. Carruthers remains on Tennessee's roster of inmates for whom all direct appeals have been exhausted, and his case illustrates how capital sentences progress through a prolonged legal process under state and federal review before reaching a final execution schedule. These developments underscore both the complexity of capital appeals and the precise legal standards that govern eligibility for execution. To follow how ongoing competency proceedings and final legal preparations unfold in this case, make sure you subscribe now, and if you think the appeals process was adequate or flawed, share your perspective in the comments. In late 2025, the highest court in Tennessee issued a formal order setting an execution date for Tony Von Carruthers. After more than 3 decades of judicial review, the Tennessee Supreme Court decreed that Carruthers would be executed on May 21, 2026, under the authority of state law governing capital punishment. The order directed that Carruthers be notified of the method by which the Tennessee Department of Correction would carry out the sentence no later than April 21, 2026, and established procedures for notifying relevant parties if the execution were stayed by court order. This schedule marked the next procedural stage in a case that had long outlasted its original trial. The scheduled execution places Carruthers at the forefront of a series of execution dates set by the Tennessee Supreme Court for 2026. Alongside Carruthers, the court established execution dates for 3 other inmates later in the year, reflecting Tennessee's resumption of executions following a period in which procedures were reviewed and adjusted. The docket included multiple individuals with long-standing sentences, highlighting ongoing adjustments in the state's approach to carrying out capital sentences. Throughout the post-conviction process, Carruthers' legal team pursued avenues to challenge aspects of the execution schedule itself. In filings before the Supreme Court, attorneys argued that factual findings related to competency, both at the time of trial and in the context of impending execution, warranted additional review. The petition sought a certificate of commutation and urged the court to reconsider whether Carruthers was suitable for execution under prevailing legal standards. The court ultimately denied the commutation request and remanded certain competency matters to lower courts for resolution closer to the scheduled execution date. The scheduling of Carruthers' execution reflects broader procedural developments in Tennessee and nationally. Courts have increasingly scrutinized the legal mechanisms by which states set execution dates, considering both statutory requirements and constitutional safeguards. State law directs that execution notices and procedures be established well in advance of the scheduled date to ensure compliance with legal standards and to provide adequate time for review by defense counsel and the courts. With the execution date set for May 21, 2026, preparations begin within multiple branches of the criminal justice system. Defense counsel, court officials, and prison administrators must address remaining legal motions, competency evaluations, and logistical arrangements. These steps occur alongside continuing public dialogue about capital punishment, legal fairness, and the responsibilities of courts in managing long-pending death sentences. To follow developments leading up to the scheduled date and understand how Tennessee's legal procedures shape this final phase of the case, make sure you subscribe now, and if you have thoughts on the balance between justice and procedure, share them in the comments. The legal proceedings in the case of Tony Von Carruthers illustrate how the justice system addresses the most serious offenses over periods that can span decades. After his conviction in 1996, Carruthers pursued multiple levels of review, from direct appeal to post-conviction relief and federal habeas corpus petitions. In each instance, courts examined whether legal procedures had been followed correctly, whether representation met constitutional standards, and whether evidence met the established legal thresholds for review. The decisions of both state and federal courts ultimately upheld the convictions and sentences, setting the stage for further procedural actions in the case. One of the most notable aspects of this case has been Carruthers' choice to represent himself at trial after multiple appointed attorneys withdrew or were dismissed per his requests. This decision, and the subsequent legal challenges tied to it, underscore complex questions about a defendant's right to counsel and the capacity to navigate a capital case without experienced legal assistance. Courts have repeatedly determined that, despite these challenges, the trial and subsequent appeals complied with applicable standards of law. In September 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court set an execution date of May 21, 2026, after completing the required procedural reviews under state law. This scheduling reflects Tennessee's current approach to capital cases and the legal framework that governs final review and execution timing. The order also outlined procedural requirements for notifying the condemned individual of the execution method and managing any stays ordered by higher courts. This case highlights the interplay between criminal conduct, prosecutorial strategy, courtroom procedures, and appellate oversight in a capital punishment context. It also raises broader considerations about how legal systems reconcile lengthy appellate review with the need for procedural fairness and finality. Observers of this case have noted the extended timeline from conviction to scheduled execution, illustrating how modern procedures seek to balance thorough legal review with the enforcement of high-level sentences. As viewers reflect on the Carruthers case, it is worth considering how legal safeguards, procedural safeguards, and institutional oversight play a role in determining outcomes in serious criminal cases. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the use of capital punishment, understanding the legal mechanisms in play, from trial strategies to appellate rulings, enriches public comprehension of how justice is administered in complex cases. Thank you for following this documentary. If you found this analysis informative and want to explore more intricate examinations of the justice system's handling of significant criminal cases, subscribe now for future investigations. Those who choose not to subscribe should share in the comments what aspects of this case influenced their decision.